Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. Quick note before we get rolling. For the first time ever, I had some technical difficulties when recording this. We had a little bit of a situation where some of the audio was not captured. So as you're listening, there may be a couple of different points where you have an inkling that maybe something is missing, because in fact something is missing. There are just a couple of little connective sentences that might or might not be there. But the lecture is still chock full of all kinds of excellent information, because honestly, talking about a masterpiece like Small Things Like These just has to be a great thing. So apologies in advance for a couple of little, missing items, but thank you for your patience and enjoy. Some of you have already listened to Claire Keegan's Foster, or my thoughts about Claire Keegan's Foster. And honestly, I was thinking to myself, I just don't, maybe it's going to feel repetitive. Maybe there's just like too much, Claire Keegan happening at the Foxed Page. But when I started to dig into Small Things Like These, I realized I absolutely had to go ahead and, share this little journey with you. One thing is, I think I'm going to stand by this. I do like Foster slightly better. I think Foster is maybe just like the slightly better novel for me, or novella, I should say. But the Small Things Like These, which, oh my gosh, if you listen to Foster, I can never remember Small Things Like These. Like the whole time I'm like, her other book. I can never remember it. Now I can remember it, but I still kind of trip over the title. But when I reread Small Things Like These for the second time, I really came to appreciate a lot of the nuance that just for whatever reason was just not quite as impressive to me as the first time I read Foster. So I'm very happy to dig in. As always, the best piece of advice I can give you if you're wanting to learn how to read better is simply to pay more attention. And that begins, with the very front of the book and all the way through to the very back of the book. So we'll be talking today about the cover, we'll be talking about the title, we'll be talking about the opening few pages. We are then going to dive into narrative voice, the sort of stance that our narrator is taking here, which is very important. We're going to talk about figurative language. Then we're going to talk a little bit about silence and complicity. Then we're going to talk about the importance of Christmas. I wish right now that I could be somewhere where it is snowing. I am not anywhere where it is snowing. I'm in California. Honestly, it's like 80 degrees outside. I don't know, not really. And it is unusual because today is October 16th. So I am very excited to dive in. I just wish perhaps that it was snowing outside my house as well. Okay, so the first thing I will say about this amazing little gem of a novella is that I really like the title. So Claire Keegan in interviews has said that she's not, in fact, great at titles. And I don't, I actually really sympathize with that, because back in my writing days, I was never good with titles. I think it's one of these things that certain people have a certain gift for it. And it was not a gift that I had. But I loved hearing Claire Keegan's sort of wrestling with this idea of title, because she and I actually look the same way for titles, which is simply that she will finish a work and then she'll go kind of hunting back through the prose for a series of words that will be, in fact, a great title. So this is what she did with Small Things Like These. And so I really appreciate actually this use of the text in terms of finding a title. It's just, God, it's such a treat to go back and look at the prose, because in fact the prose at these three junctures when the title arrives or arises in the text are just so incredibly illustrative of how unbelievably great this prose is. So if we look at page 10, pages 10 and 11 is kind of the first time that we see this idea of small things and small things like these kind of arising from the text. So we have Bill Furlong, and it says, "Sometimes Furlong, seeing his girls going through the small things which needed to be done, genuflecting in the chapel or thanking a shopkeeper for the change, felt a deep private joy that these children were his own. Aren't we the lucky ones?" he remarked to Eileen in bed one night. "There's many that are badly off." So we have this mention of small things, right, at this, on page 10 of the book. So we have like this little notion of small things. And in this case, it's because Bill Furlong is really appreciating these little kind of rituals and these little, actions, these little tasks that his daughters take on, and that his 5 daughters, and really bring a lot of pride to him. And interestingly, here they're genuflecting, which is just kneeling before you enter into the pew at a Catholic church. And the other is giving money back, giving change back to a merchant. And in both of these cases, those are extremely important. So Catholicism is going to, bending the knee to the Catholic Church is something that is very, very central to this little novella. And this idea of monetary exchange and this idea of monetary exchange is also going to be very important. So these are small things that are occurring. And he's saying that these small things, in fact, he's saying that they give him a lot of joy. So there's quite a bit of attention being paid to small things here. So then a little bit further down on page 10, Bill Furlong says to his wife Eileen, "Mick Sinnett's little chap was out on the road again today foraging for sticks." And then across the road, across the page here on page 11, it says, Eileen is saying, "Sinnett was stocious at the phone box on Tuesday," stocious being drunk. "The poor man," Furlong said, "whatever ails him. Drink is what ails him." So then we get into this conversation. They move from the little things that the girls are, the small things that the girls are doing that bring him pride. And they move on to this idea of people who are suffering, people who are having a hard time. So, you can see, if you're looking at the YouTube channel, you can see here, this is page 10. We have this notion of small things. But by the time we have gotten over to page 11 here, where we're going to have the complete form of the title, the sense of it has shifted. Because here in the beginning, the very first mention is about the sort of pride he's feeling in his girls. But by the time we have the full version of it, what he is thinking about, in fact, are people who are having a hard time. So at the bottom of page 11 here, some nights Furlong lay there with Eileen, going over small things like these. So the small things like these that end up preoccupying him are things like the fact that Mick Sinnett is really fallen on hard times because presumably he's an alcoholic, and Furlong is feeling sympathetic and Eileen is not feeling so sympathetic, which is another thing that we're going to have play out during the book. And you also have this sense of poverty. You have this sense of people suffering, people having a hard time, and Bill Furlong being acutely aware of people suffering. And these are these small things like these, which both come to capture the idea of the girls and these sort of lovely small things that they do that inspire pride and joy in their father. But then also this idea of the small things like these being the fact that people are suffering. So right from the beginning, it's much like Foster. You have this kind of multivalence. The word ends up having, the title ends up having a lot of different sort of nuance and meaning. We see it crop up again on page 107. So this is a very important point because it's one of the few times we see Bill Furlong, in his memory, interacting with his mother, who died when he was 16. 12. She got pregnant when she was 16, and she died when she was 28, and Bill was 12. So the reason I mention that is because on the Booker Prize winners website, they say something about how the mother died when she was 16. And I, who really love nothing more than a Booker Prize winner, I was just like, wait, how are you people being so sloppy? Like, this is the Booker Prize committee. How come you have such a sloppy thing on your website? But in fact, I went back and checked, and she got pregnant at 16. She dies 12 years later. Okay, so, but we have this interaction with her son here. And she had slapped him too sometimes for being bold or talking out of turn or leaving the lid off the butter dish. But those things were only small. So it's not exactly a verbatim thing. It's not small things like these, but it's another kind of morphing of the title. So if you're paying attention to the title, which you should be, then you'll see these other kind of iterations of it cropping up. And again, this is 107. We're getting toward the end of the novella, but it's still so significant. So what she is punishing him for is being bold and talking out of turn, which are exactly the things that this novella is hinging on. We have this sort of question of whether or not he is going to stand up against the forces that be, or whether he is not going to do that. So we have this idea from a very young age that his mother was reinforcing this idea that he needed to stay silent and he needed to be complicit in anything that would be even remotely threatening. Okay, so again, we have this iteration. Those things were only small. And then on page 113, this is the last iteration that we are going to look at before we jump into the beginning of the book. So on page 113, he thought of Mrs. Wilson being the woman who allows his mother's employer. And his mother's employer, Mrs. Wilson, allows them to stay in the house even after his mother becomes pregnant. He thought of Mrs. Wilson, of her daily kindnesses, of how she had corrected and encouraged him, of the small things she had said and done, and had refused to do and say, and what she must have known, the things which, when added up, amounted to a life. It's so lovely. And again, here we are toward the end of the novel. In fact, it's like the penultimate page of the novel, the novella. And we have this real sort of loading up of the title and this kind of reprise of the title, that these small things like these, whether we are talking about the things that bring pride, whether we're talking about being compassionate to other people suffering, whether we're talking about being generous like Mrs. Wilson, those small things are what add up to a life. So for someone, I'm thinking of Claire Keegan here, someone who says that she's not great with titles, she may not be great with coming up with them beforehand or coming up with something super inventive, but when she is mining the text for the title, she's doing a great job. I mean, this is really a title that resonates throughout, both at the beginning and at the very end, and that is sort of shifting as we go in a way that's really significant and beautiful. I'm not going to spoil anything within the first I don't know. I'm going to try not to spoil anything the whole time. How about that? I'll try to do that, but I can't guarantee anything. If I do, I might bleep it out myself like I do on some of my other things, but hopefully it won't come to that. Okay, so we're going to dive in now past the beautiful cover, and we're going to get to the dedication. This story is dedicated to the women and children who suffered time in Ireland's mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries. So this is a very interesting thing to me. She gives us this kind of dedication, but we don't have a good sense yet of what exactly she is talking about. We don't really know what is, if you're me, and you are American and you're 54, you might not know what Ireland's mother and baby homes are, and I certainly didn't know what the Magdalen laundries were. I got a sense, I could guess what the mother and baby homes were all about in a strictly Catholic, a Catholic country. And then this idea of the Magdalen laundries, again, was a bit of a mystery. So, but what's great is that we, not until the very end of the book, if you read this, the way a normal person should, which is from the beginning to the end, you find out in the end what exactly is happening with that afterword that is chock full of really interesting citations and really fairly damning information. But at this point, we don't really know what is going to be happening. I, of course, went and read the acknowledgments because I always like to find out who these people's agents are and who they're, I'm such a weird literary groupie that I'll read through the acknowledgments just to see if they're hanging out with any other writers. I'm like, oh my God, wait, is Claire Keegan hanging out with Anna Burns? Incredible writer of Milkman. It's like that kind of groupie thing is happening. So I like to look at that stuff. And then, there's that kind of afterword or addendum or whatever it is. And so, of course, I read that. So I did have a sense before diving in. I had a little more information, I think, than your average reader might. And actually, that it didn't really matter to me because I don't read for suspense and plot and stuff. But it was, I think it would have been maybe a little cooler to not know what was, sort of happening, what was happening in the text here. It's also interesting, and for Mary McKay, teacher. So Claire Keegan was born in 1968. I'm pretty sure that's right. She's 55. She was born in Ireland, fairly close to where this takes place, kind of in the middle of Ireland, in from the eastern coast. So she was born there, and was the youngest in a very large Irish Catholic family, then went to New Orleans and went to Loyola University, good Catholic university, I imagine, from the name, and met Mary McKay there. Mary McKay sounds pretty Irish to me. And I don't know if Mary McKay, I don't know. She's also apparently an Olympic swimmer. There was something cute on her website that said something like she gave up like Olympic swimming because she couldn't read while she was swimming, which is like a little bit cute and a little twee, but also so rad. Like that's like, I mean, that's why I don't swim. Just kidding. That is not why I don't swim. I don't swim because I don't love to swim. But it would also take me away from reading. So Mary McKay, teacher, it turns out if you look at Claire Keegan's websites about the fiction courses she gives, that Professor McKay, who is now Professor Emerita at Loyola in New Orleans, she gives some summer courses in, there was actually one on the short story that she was giving in Ireland in like 2021 or something. And I was just like bereft because I would have been there. I mean, 2021, probably not. I probably would not have been there. I would not have risked my life and flown to Ireland, but sounds like it would have been a very, very cool course on the short story. Okay, so we have Mary McKay, teacher. And then we're going to move on. And this is this very important proclamation of the Irish Republic, 1916. So they were given kind of sovereignty, or however you would call that. They were made a republic, a country unto their own. They were given independence from Britain in 1918. So this is the proclamation they made in 1916. I'm fairly certain that's correct. If you're gonna like quote me or something, maybe check first, just to be nice, because I'm not totally sure. Okay, but this is what it says. The Irish Republic is entitled to and hereby claims the allegiance of every Irishman and Irish woman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens, and declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and of all of its parts, cherishing all of the children of the nation equally. So the fact that this is taken out of the proclamation and the fact that it ends with cherishing all of the children of the nation equally. So if we have that, and that is the ending, which means there's a lot of emphasis on that last part, the idea of treating all of the children equally. We have talked about this, I was going to say ad nauseum, and it's not like, that makes it sound very tiresome. But we talk a lot about the fact that the ending words in a sentence, and certainly in a paragraph, and certainly in a chapter, they have a lot of weight because all of the force of the paragraph or sentence are sort of building toward it. And then even if it's just a sentence and it's only hanging out, in your brain for the space between the period and the capital letter of the next sentence, there's like a brief gap where your mind gets to kind of stick with that word for a moment. So here, the idea of equally being the last word of this little excerpt from the proclamation, and the children being treated equally, kind of gives you a sense that that's maybe what Claire Keegan is going to be taking up during the course of this novel. And if you put that together with the mother and children hospitals or homes, it's not a hospital, they're homes, the mother and baby homes and the Magdalene laundries from the page before, you can start piecing together that one of the things she is going to highlight here is the experience of the children in the nation. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about figurative language because so many of the details that Claire Keegan is supplying are really working overtime. They're often symbolic, or they have to do, there's some sort of pathetic fallacy where nature is mirroring, the emotions, or you're foreshadowing, or, it's a really beautiful metaphor or simile. So we're going to talk about that usage of language first, but it's important to think about this as being spare and very brief in the same way that Foster is. Okay, diving in. In October, there were yellow trees. Then the clocks went back the hour, and the long November winds came in and blew and stripped the trees bare. Okay, so beautiful. So we have this idea of, we're deep into the fall. It's October. I would imagine October in Ireland is particularly, chilly and fall-like as opposed to California. And this idea of yellow trees, it's very it sounds like almost like a child narrator. We have this idea of like a very kind of basic kind of description, a very simplistic and sort of stripped down kind of narration. But then the clocks went back the hour. So there is something right away that feels very Irish to me. The clocks went back the hour. Maybe in the United States we'd say, the clocks were set back an hour, or they fell back an hour, even. Well, sorry. Or we set the clocks back an hour. It's the idea of the clocks went back the hour. There's something in that cadence to me. I can't pinpoint it because I'm learning Irish on Duolingo, but my Irish is not good enough to understand why that would have come from the original Irish and would be affecting this instantiation of English here. So then the clocks went back the hour, and the long November winds came in and blew and stripped the trees bare. So you have this idea of October and November passing very quickly. We're beginning with October in this declarative sentence, and then very quickly November's coming through and it's stripping the trees bare. So trees, whenever you come across a tree, certainly when you come across like an apple or a fig tree, you need to think about Eden, and you need to think about the Garden of Eden and the fact that trees and, apple trees in particular, or fig trees, are really very much about the tree of knowledge. And they're about this idea of original sin, and this idea that, because Adam, ate from the tree of knowledge, he gained knowledge, and that knowledge was in fact that he was, flawed and naked and full of sin. And in a Catholic country, there is very much this sense of, having been born with sins and needing to sort of get going right away on all of the cleansing, all of the communion, and all of the baptism, and all of these things to sort of, cleanse even a tiny baby of all their sins that they're born with. So the idea of these yellow trees, it's not, red trees, it's not trees with apples, it's not green trees, it's not growth. So in Foster, we have so much green, and it's all about growth, and it's springtime moving into summer. Here we are in the fall, clearly. And then the trees themselves are being stripped and they are bare. So you have this sense not of burgeoning spring, and not of kind of the fecundity of the harvest and the summer and all of that kind of richness. In fact, we have this stripping down and this kind of moving toward something that is very dire, something that is akin to death, essentially. Okay, and then we are going to bump down to the first sentence of the next paragraph. The people, for the most part, unhappily endured the weather. So we have the people are unhappily enduring the weather. And then we're going to move to the next page where we see the introduction of Bill Furlong. Down in the yard, Bill Furlong, the coal and timber merchant, rubbed his hands, saying if things carried on as they were, they would soon need a new set of tires for the lorry. So we have this Bill Furlong. He's the first person we are meeting. Is that true? I think that's true. Yeah. He's the first person we're meeting by name. So I was very happy that Claire Keegan offered up the town of New Ross, because in fact the town of New Ross exists in Ireland. So you can see these pictures. I'll flash them up right now. If you're on YouTube, you are seeing the town of New Ross. I pictured it on the coast because they were talking about the quays, and they were talking about the sailors coming in and bringing the coal and the timber and the anthracite. In fact, it's on the River Barrow. So it's on a river, but it is relatively close to the coast, and it is very sort of bustling, not a seaport town, but like a port town. Okay, so what is important here to look at is this idea, well, there's lots of things that are important, but what I want to take a look at now is the narrative stance. So this is very firmly a third-person narrator. What we have here, a sentence like, in October, there were yellow trees. It's very kind of abstract. We don't know who is telling us this story. It's this kind of godlike figure. So when you think of omniscience, it's omni and then science. So it's sort of being aware of everything, omni being everything, and science sort of being like sentient. So you have this idea of something that, a force that knows everything. I will say it again. I mentioned this at one point. I had a writing teacher who believed that you could only write in the third person, really write in a really good omniscient narrative voice if you believed in God, which I don't actually think that is true. But you have a sense here of this sort of omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing narrator from the beginning. But almost from that first sentence, when we have, then the clocks went back the hour, and the long November winds came in and blew and stripped the trees bare. And then certainly when we get to this next part, Bill Furlong was saying if things carried on as they were, they would soon need a new set of tires for the lorry. So quickly we are moving in this really seamless, beautiful way that I think as the reader you may not have even clocked. You move from this omniscient narrator who is this kind of all-knowing godlike force that is this kind of anonymous authority figure. Sounds a lot like God. And then we're moving pretty quickly into this sort of closer proximity with Bill Furlong. So it's very subtle again, but it says right here, down in the yard, Bill Furlong, the coal and timber merchant. So we're getting some information about him still. The camera's kind of way back. We're still seeing this as like a very third person thing. We don't know who Bill Furlong is. We're given both his first and last name. We're given his occupation. So we're still kind of far away from him. Then we're coming in much closer where it says rubbed his hands. So we're getting this kind of intimate thing. We know that he's maybe cold. We're seeing this gesture. That's a very subtle gesture. So we know we're meant to pay a lot of attention to what is going to happen with him. Saying if things carried on as they were, they would soon need a new set of tires for the lorry. So this is symbolic. Later on, he says something about the engine failing. It's very, well, we're going to get to the symbolism of Bill Furlong being the coal merchant and the engine of his truck failing. We're going to get to that in a bit. But you have essentially what are his words. So if things carried on as they were, they would soon need a new set of tires for the lorry. That's like, you can hear him saying, if things carry on the way they are, we're going to need a new set of tires for the lorry. There's a sense of us like, it's still a third person. It's still very firmly third person. It's not that Bill is saying this in quotation marks or it's I said, blah, blah, blah. But we have this sense of kind of becoming one with him and hearing his voice in a way that's very significant. Okay, we're going to look a little bit more at this really beautiful narrator that's getting very close. It's kind of a close third person in the sense that we are very close to what Bill is thinking and feeling. So across the way here on page 3, during busy times like these, Furlong made most of the deliveries himself, leaving the yardmen to bag up the next orders and cut and split the loads of felled trees the farmers brought in. Through the mornings, the saws and shovels could be heard going hard at it, but when the Angelus bell rang at noon, the men laid down their tools, washed the black off their hands, and went round to Kehoe's, where they were fed hot dinners with soup and fish and chips on Fridays. Furlong, so he's being addressed by his last name. So on some level, we are keeping a distance from him. It's still this third person narrator that is distanced. He made most of the deliveries himself, leaving the yardmen leaving the yardmen behind. So this idea of him going off by himself, we know on some level that we're going to stay with him because he's leaving the yardmen behind. So basically, we are going to be close with him. We're going to be seeing what he's seeing, going the places he's going, and not sticking around with the yardmen who are doing their thing. But it gets very kind of intimate in some ways because when he says, when the narrator says, through the mornings, the saws and shovels could be heard. And that is so beautiful because the saws, you get the saws sounds very much like the noise a saw would make. And shovel is, listen to that, shovel. It's like exactly the noise that the shovel would be making when it's, shoveling up that. I hope that isn't hurting people's ears. I'm wondering if I'm saying that really loud into your poor ears if you're listening on some sort of headphones. But it's very onomatopoetic here, and I love that because what she is doing is she's giving us the sounds that Bill Furlong is hearing. So we are hearing the same sounds that he is hearing. Through the mornings, the saws and shovels could be heard going hard at it. So this is another one of those little phrases. Going hard at it is a colloquial phrase that we presume is Bill's voice. It's a little bit like when we first saw on the very, very opening about the clocks went back the hour. The clocks went back the hour is, to my mind, has somewhat of an unusual ring. It feels very Irish. It also, I mean, time and things getting darker. Whenever you hear time, whenever time comes up in a novel, you should be thinking about time passing. You should be thinking about death. It's not uplifting, but it is very much one of the things that this novel is preoccupied with. So this idea of going hard at it, it is a phrase that I think we should identify as Bill's, and again reinforces this idea that yes, we have this third person narrator, but that a lot of the time it's going to be a close third, and we're going to be like right sort of in Bill's head, as it were. Okay, and when the Angelus bell rang at noon, so that is also assuming that we understand what the Angelus bell is. I did not know. I picked this up, didn't even research it. I picked it up from this trusty gem of a novella. I believe it rings at 12 and 6, at least. We hear it ring at 12 and 6. And in fact, the second time when it rings at 6 o'clock, it was confusing to me because then all the men like went home or something. And I was like, wait, why are they going home at noon? But there is something very flattering that's happening here, which is that our narrator / Bill is totally trusting the fact that we, as the reader, know what the Angelus bell is. So if you don't know what that is, you are sort of flattered that like somebody might think that you would know that. And you have enough context clues here because he says when the Angelus bell rang at noon, you know it's some sort of bell. And from the word Angelus, this looks a lot like the word angel, and also like, oh, I was going to say Adustus Fidelis or whatever there's a Latin, that really beautiful Latin. I think it's a Christmas carol. But, Angelus to me sounds like some sort of Latin hymn that you might be singing if you're Catholic. So this idea of the Angelus bell ringing, you do, I would think most readers would understand that this is in Ireland, some sort of a Catholic bell, a church bell that is ringing at noon. It's going to ring again at 6. And when it does, the men do this thing where they laid down their tools, washed the black off their hands. So washing the black off their hands, I mean, there's a lot of, sort of hand washing and a lot of hand wringing actually on Bill's part. But this idea of washing yourself clean is something that should be a central preoccupation, not central. It should be a minor preoccupation throughout the work because a lot of this is Bill's sort of internal turmoil about whether or not he is going to sort of allow this kind of blackness to stay, on his hands, the blackness of the reality that he discovers. Okay, and then they went round to Kehoe's. So went round to Kehoe's, even that to me sounds a bit like, Bill's kind of voice, the way he might describe that, like we went round to Kehoe's, where they were fed hot dinners with soup and fish and chips on Fridays. So again, we're reinforcing these two ideas. This is information that Bill knows. So we know that Bill would know this well because Bill, in fact, is going often with these men for their hot dinners. Dinner, of course, here being lunch, the noontime meal. And fish and chips on Fridays, of course, is because they are Catholic. So they don't eat meat on Fridays. So you would have fish and chips on Fridays. But that kind of insider information, whether or not you as a reader are registering it, that is like allowing you to know that this is information that is being provided to us from Bill. So another thing's happening here, and it's really beautiful, which is that Bill is... I was going to say like a little bit of like a pastor, but I don't really mean that. What I mean is pastor. Just kidding. But what I mean is shepherd. And pastor to me in Spanish sounds a little more like shepherd. So maybe that's why I was thinking pastor. He feels to me like a shepherd in the best sense. So, and in fact, I think you can argue in lots of ways that Bill is sort of a Christ figure. But this idea of Christ as being, a shepherd, he's taking care of the men. And in fact, he's taking care of lots of people. He's taking care of his family, his girls. In this case, right from the very beginning, the end of the first chapter, we have this idea of him as taking care of the men. He's doing a lot of the deliveries himself. They're doing the work. They're having the warm meal. And he's watching over them a little bit like you would watch over your flock, as it were. Okay, and then we're going to look at page 5. So this is... I mean, here we are, God, many minutes into this lecture, and we're only on page 5. But this is the kind of careful, close reading that will just really reap all sorts of reward as you are moving through the novel, because you'll just get so much more out of it. So on page 5, beginning of chapter 2, we have this. Furlong had come from nothing, less than nothing, some might say. His mother at the age of 16 had fallen pregnant while working as a domestic for Mrs. Wilson, the Protestant widow who lived in the big house a few miles out of town. So this idea, the very first sentence here again feels pretty omniscient. Furlong had come from nothing. So part of that's because we have, again, this use of his last name only, but Furlong had come from nothing. And it's this idea of the camera pulling way back, and this notion of like, this man who we are seeing from a distance, because we're calling him by his last name, came from nothing. But then again, we shift into this more intimate kind of tone where less than nothing, some might say. So that's something that you could hear Bill saying in all of his humility, all of his Christ-like humility. But you also could hear this as a kind of a rumor. And I like the idea of it as being a rumor, because you have this kind of this notion of a lot of rumors that are spinning around this town. And then we have kind of like the facts. His mother at the age of 16 had fallen pregnant. So fallen pregnant, I'm sure that that's an Irish colloquialism, but again, it's getting us closer to Bill's language, to Furlong's language, because it is colloquial. While working as a domestic, and again, it's not a servant, or I mean, I guess you would say domestic if you're Mrs. Wilson too. But when he gets to Mrs. Wilson, the Protestant widow who lived in the big house, she wouldn't necessarily describe herself. She wouldn't have to say Protestant, because everybody would already know that about her. And the idea of who lived in the big house, it's not the big house, I made it sound like jail, but who lived in the big house a few miles out of town. The idea there of the big house as being described as the big house is alluding to the fact, again, that we are seeing this from Bill's perspective. Maybe to Mrs. Wilson, this seems like any other house. I was so impressed in my second reading by how subtle and yet so effective and really very clear the sort of social stratification is throughout this book. We are spending most of our time here with people like poor Mick Sinnott and his little boy, who Mick Sinnott clearly has a drinking problem, and his little boy is fetching sticks and like looking for, food and warmth because they have fallen on hard times. And you get a sense of a lot of people being unemployed, and this sense of everyone being in debt and of real poverty. But there also are these allusions to people like Mrs. Wilson living in big houses, or there's that beautiful part toward the end of the novel where Bill Furlong is walking past the windows of the fancier houses. So you have this sense of social stratification that, again, is very subtle, but is very important, because really it is it's the poverty-stricken people who are really, it's the people in need, the people who are suffering, who are really the heart of this novel. Okay, dive into figurative language. What I find is that she has, again, this is why you need to read these books more than once or twice, is because you really begin to appreciate how just incredibly subtle, but incredibly well done, all of her figurative languages. So we're going to be talking about symbolism. We're going to be talking about mirrors and reflection in particular. We're going to talk about liminal spaces, and I think that is it, which is a lot. Okay, so just in terms of symbolism, I'm going to just run through a few of the things that are highly symbolic. So one of the things we talk about at the Foxed page is that it's fine to be like, oh, wait, hey, this tree is symbolic of the Garden of Eden, and these people are, recognizing that they are flawed and whatever, damaged or naked or however you want to think about it. But it's really good to then say, like, so what? So you can identify these things as symbols, but it's good then to take one step further and think, like, what is it that what is this author trying to do with this symbol? So it's very symbolic that Bill Furlong is in fact warming the community. So he's a coal delivery man, which could be kind of, there are lots of different ways that could go. You could talk about, darkness or dirtiness, or, there are all sorts of different things that you could do. But what becomes very clear is that he's very generously supporting everyone in a way that's very foundational. People need to be warm. It's just, especially in the dead of winter, and it's really, I mean, things are very, it's not the dead of winter, what am I saying? But it's December, so it's very cold. So this idea that he's warming the community is important. In a book where there aren't a lot of details, when you are given a specific detail, it's important to be like, oh, wait, it's not just a jigsaw puzzle. It is a jigsaw puzzle of a farm. So you have this sense of him having all of these different pieces as a child. I mean, he doesn't know who his father is. He's really trying to figure out a lot about his sort of upbringing. His mother dies. He's trying to figure out his place in the world. So you have this kind of jigsaw puzzle that he is trying to piece together of his life, and it's also of a farm. So you have this sense of wanting, a certain life, wanting a certain kind of bucolic, kind of pastoral, kind of like idyllic kind of way of life. And we are at a point in Ireland, it's 1985, where and this is mentioned clearly in the book, that there is a real economic downturn. So I believe in 1980, the unemployment rate was 7%, and in 1990 it was 17%. So you're having this major economic downturn when a lot of the ways that Irish people were surviving were not viable anymore. So you have this sense of him sort of wanting to go back to this time when you could be, you could live as a farmer. Okay, again, I mentioned this before, but there's a part on page 94 when he says something about the engine was giving out. So you have this idea of the truck and the tires, and this truck sort of, the engine of the truck, which he is very much reliant upon the truck. And in some ways he kind of is the truck. He's using the truck to drive around and warm people. He's also using it to discover the nefarious things that are happening in town. So you have this sense of the engine of this warmth and generosity is beginning to give out. So, and the tires are wearing. I mean, this is a guy who is fatigued. And the fatigue, actually, there's a lot of that too that is discussed. The black and white tiles, and black and white in general as a motif, it's a very important motif. A motif is just like a kind of a set of symbols that keeps recurring throughout the course of a piece of literature. Black and white was very important in Foster, and part of that is because our narrator in there, who is like a 9 or 10-year-old, she is so young that she's seeing things in very black and white terms. I think in this book, a lot of the black and white stuff that is happening has to do with this very Manichaean. Manichaean is just like the idea of good and evil, or of good and good and evil, and black and white. Like things are very, there's no gray area. Things are either one way or they're another. So there is this real sense of things being black and white, and this black and white motif comes up again and again. When he's tiny, he's in the kitchen at Mrs. Wilson's house, and he realizes the floor it's checkered, with these black and white checkers. And there's this beautifully symbolic line about how when he's little, he just recognizes they're black and white squares. And at some point he realizes it's like a drafts board, which is like checkers, and realizes that essentially life is about either taking the other piece or being taken. So again, you have this reinforcement of this real sort of zero-sum game, this like idea of things being black or white. You're either good or evil. You're either fallen or you're virtuous. You're either Catholic or you're not. I mean, everything is very sort of black and white in lots of ways. And we see that black and white motif again and again. At Kehoe's, in the end, he receives a piece of advice from Mrs. Kehoe, and it is a reinforcement of complicity and silence. And he looks down on the ground, and there are these black interlocking rings on the ground. On the carpet of her place, which is so funny. I was like, oh gosh, Mrs. Kehoe's restaurant is carpeted. Which restaurants that are carpeted, it never makes a lot of sense to me. It always seems kind of gross. Anyway, he looks down and he sees these black interlocking rings, and it's not against white, but it kind of evokes that first floor where you did have those black and white squares. We also, with this white and black theme. You have a lot about the darkness of the river. The river is always very dark, dark, dark. Dark is stout, which is very dark, a very dark beer. And you have the innocence and kind of the cleanliness of the snow that is falling. So you have, even in nature, things tend to be black and white. We also have the river itself, which at one point Bill is kind of jealous of the I keep calling him Bill. Maybe I should call him Furlong, but I feel like I know him really well. He's jealous of the river because it's this idea that the river knows her course. So it's this sense that the river is just flowing, the river is doing what the river does, whereas he has a lot of choices, and he has some difficult choices to make. We also have the black and white motif reinforced with the birds. So there are lots of crows. In fact, one of the beautiful opening lines, Claire Keegan's opening lines and closing lines of each chapter are unbelievably great. But I think the line is like, it was a December of crows. And then like people had never seen so many or something like that. So you have this proliferation of the crows, and crows are pretty menacing. We have a lot of them. It seems like we have more and more all the time. We have a lot of them right now in California near our house. And they're big and kind of menacing looking. And, the noises that they make are really loud and really kind of commanding. So you have this sense of them as being kind of foreboding. It's a little bit of like a harbinger of something bad. It's kind of like a black cat. But he also very specifically says at one point when he's watching them strut along that one of them looked like one of the abbots from the abbey, one of the men with his hands behind his back kind of strutting along, which you can see that very bird-like feel. And the black and white of these crows also is meant, I believe, to have us think of the nuns, with their black habits with the white. So a lot of this black and white stuff is tied back to the nuns and the monks, and the abbots, monks, I think that's right. But you have them in these dark, like black and white kind of clothing, and also very much because their thinking is so black and white. Things are either a sin or they're virtuous. There's not a lot of middle ground. Okay, we also have the symbolic presence of a lot of locks, a lot of padlocks, a lot of frozen locks. He's having to thaw the locks. So you have a lot of this real sense of him as being locked out, but these idea of locks as being very important throughout the whole entire book. And then, oh my gosh, well, I'm not going to talk about this. There is the Christmas present. I'll leave it at this. The Christmas present that he buys for his wife at the end becomes very symbolic. I'm not going to tell you why. Okay. And then the names are very symbolic as well. So we have Bill. So Bill, there's a lot of concern about debt. So you have this idea of a bill, and a bill as needing to be paid. But also he is named William. He is named William after the kings, is what they say in the book, because it's not an Irish name, it's an English name. So you have this idea of him as sort of, being born in the big house, and being raised he's raised clearly by a Catholic mother, but raised, with a lot of influence from a woman who is Protestant, and he's given an English name, not in fact an Irish name. Of course, he goes by Bill, and Billy at times, the Mother Superior, which is another name that is very symbolic. This Mother Superior who has all this authority, that name, like your mother is already sort of symbolic enough. And he has these substitute mothers, Mrs. Wilson, but also, he calls Mother Superior mother again and again and again. So you have this idea of this substitute mother and this woman who is wielding authority over many, many people. In fact, she thinks she's very superior. She acts very superior. And in terms of the Catholic hierarchy, obviously she is very superior. But you have, I totally lost my train of thought here. Oh, the names. So you have his name Bill, which is both William and Bill, as in like what is owing. And then you also, his last name is Furlong. So you have this idea of racing, it's like a distance in a race track. So you have the idea of that, but you also have this sense of like not for long. Like I have this sense of for long, as being sort of a temporal thing, and sort of like he's maybe, his life is going to be short. He's acutely aware of time passing, of his girls growing older, and he has this decision to make about whether he's going to remain complicit or whether he is going, to do the right heroic thing. Okay, great. I mean, I could go on and on actually about the names, but we're not gonna dig in much further than that. Oh, although I will say Eileen. So Eileen is his wife, and Eileen is leaning in lots of ways toward the Catholic Church and is not kind of leaning in the direction of her husband. She's wanting him to lean in her direction. So there's a lot of sort of Eileen going on there. You have this sense, even from when he was very small, that he's looking for himself in many places. He's looking for himself in reflection. And in fact, the question of who his father is really sort of brought to the fore at one point when he's at the barber shop and he's looking for vestiges of certain people in his face. So he's looking at his own reflection in order to find out who he is, like literally find out who his father might be. So you have this sense of reflections as being very important. At one point when he is in the convent, he sees himself reflected in all of the shiny pots and pans, and he's reflected in windows, he's reflected in all sorts of surfaces. And you get this sense, as the novel is kind of rolling along, whenever someone is looking in surfaces like that, again, you need to step back a little and say, okay, this is clearly symbolic. We're looking at ourself here. And it's this question of sort of what is the person looking for? In this case, is he looking for a certain resemblance? Or is it that he is wrestling with his conscience because he wants, the reflection that is reflected back to him to be congruent with who he is and what he feels? So one of the main things in the book that we have touched on is this idea of complicity and this idea of everyone keeping silent about something that is happening. And when I say that, I'm not spoiling anything, because literally on the back cover, they talk about that. Something is happening, and Bill discovers something. And the question is, is he going to stay complicit, or is he going to sort of report this, and is he going to try to make some sort of change? So every time he sees himself in a reflective surface, you have this sense that he's sort of both trying to figure out who he is and sort of like what type of person is he going to be. And it's really beautiful because that crystallizes at the very end of the book, and on page 113, again, the penultimate page of the book, he asks himself this: was it possible to carry on along through all the years, the decades, through an entire life, without once being brave enough to go against what was there and yet call yourself a Christian and face yourself in the mirror? Very clear why we have this preoccupation with mirrors and why there are so many mirrors. And it is, in fact, because he needs to know if he can face himself, if he can feel good enough about himself as a person, to sort of move forward in life. It's just a beautiful series, these reflections, a beautiful series of different symbolism moments that are very important. In addition to this idea of these mirrors as reflecting him, another kind of use of figurative language that we have throughout the entire novel is something called liminal spaces. So we have lots and lots of these liminal spaces. So liminal spaces is simply I really love it as a term because it's one of those terms that helps define something for you. Whenever you see a character in a doorway, or in a passageway or a hallway or on steps, front steps or back steps, or when you see someone who's in, a place of flux, even an airport or a bus station, that is a time often when people are confronted with the possibility of change. And Bill Furlong is constantly in these liminal spaces. At one point, Claire Keegan in one of the interviews said something like, he's a man who's often in doorways. And it's true. And he's often in doorways that are very contentious and difficult, or very seductive and kind of, luring him in. But you have this idea of him as really making a lot of choices and being, he's not stagnant and in one space. He's constantly moving in and out of worlds and out of spaces. So you have this really beautiful, this chance, liminal spaces are really very much about a chance to evolve. And in fact, he over the course of the book, that is the main preoccupation, is whether or not he is going to evolve and be someone who can look himself in the mirror, if he can sort of pass through these places and do the thing that is kind of heroic. So we're going to look at page 61. There are also a lot of locked doors that he is running into, and a lot of frozen locks. So these are situations where the idea of him as being barred from something, or it's really driving home the idea of complicity and the idea of everyone else being quiet, and this idea of sort of whether or not he's going to kind of bust through these spaces, see what is there to be seen, and then actually do something about it. So this is on page 61. The bolt was stiff with frost, and he had to ask himself if he had not turned into a man consigned to doorways. The idea of the kettle, when he goes and gets the kettle to run the hot water over the lock, you get this sense of really how frigid and how cold and how foreboding all of this kind of weather is. But it's also very symbolic in the sense that everything is sort of frozen over and stiff and unyielding in a way that amplifies his kind of paralysis. By the way, quick note, paralysis is, so James Joyce, who was a very important Irish writer around the turn of the 20th century, interestingly, he only wrote about Dublin, but he was very much not a fan of the idea of the Irish Renaissance, meaning the Irish language and being sort of very proud of being like a native Irish person. He left Ireland, again, right around the time of the independence. He moved to Paris. He didn't come back. He had children that he named Italian names because he was so kind of unhappy with Ireland and yet deeply nostalgic about Ireland. So he left the UK, spent a lot of time in Paris, a lot of time in Italy, but you have this sense of him as always being preoccupied with paralysis. And one of his very best stories, I think it's the best thing he's ever written, which is called The Dead. It's at the end of Dubliners. It is a novella, I believe. It's usually packaged, well, it's part of Dubliners, so it's the last story. It's a kind of a longish short story at the end of Dubliners, but it's a story around Christmas time, and there's snow falling, and you have someone in it who is very who is suffering actually a lot of the same paralysis that we have with Bill Furlong here, and it's a really beautiful story, and it's very hard not to see the resonance between the two of them simply because of the snowfall and this idea of snow as sort of muffling and covering over things. Okay, but it's interesting that there are women who are talking to him. He has these important conversations about sort of like, what do you know? Like, and shouldn't we be doing something about it? And it really helps you understand the perspective and why people are being quiet. A lot is at stake here. And both of these female forces, his wife Eileen and Mrs. Kehoe, who is another kind of maternal figure because she's providing food for all of the workers. You know, she's very kind of nurturing and takes care of them in some ways. But both of those kind of like the main maternal figures in some ways, the mother superior is like the least maternal person in the book. But you have these two women as trying to convince him of everything that is at stake. So you're going to need to read the book yourself to read more about complicity. But you also, if you just think about Catholicism, you know, when you're confessing your sins, it's behind this literal like shroud, behind a closed door. It's only the priest who hears. Presumably the priest is not sharing any of your secrets. So it's a very secret intensive kind of religion, and this idea that things should be unspoken and that things need to follow certain protocols, and that you need to sort of got to say your Hail Marys and expunge yourself of the sin, but that it is all in secret. A lot of stuff is kept kind of on the down low, as it were. But what I do want to talk about briefly is the importance of these strong women. So part of me is always reading texts, like with this idea of like, is this a feminist text in mind? It's always kind of in the back of my head. And I really loved the way here that Claire Keegan talks about the strength of these women in these really kind of orthogonal ways. It's not heavy-handed, and it's things that Bill is observing, but it's also a real testament, in fact, to how powerful these women are. So we're going to look at pages 24 and 25. So this is when Bill and his wife Eileen are with all of the girls, and they're writing the letters. And it's this very beautiful scene. They're making the Christmas cake, and the girls are writing their letters to Santa Claus. So, and this is right when Bill has been thinking about the puzzle that he didn't get and how he didn't get either of the things that he wanted from Santa Claus. Did Santy ever come to you, Daddy? Sheila now asked, eerily. They could be like young witches sometimes, his daughters, with their black hair and sharp eyes. It was easy to understand why women feared men with their physical strength and lust and social powers. But women, with their canny intuitions, were so much deeper. They could predict what was to come long before it came, dream it overnight, and read your mind. So you have this real sense of women as being uncanny in this very powerful way. And this idea that they could predict things actually does happen. So at one point, Eileen has this dream about one of the girls having a rotten tooth and having to pull the rotten tooth out. And sure enough, they go to the dentist and they find out later that the girl has this rotten tooth that needs to be pulled. And it's very subtle and it's very quick. If you've already read the book, maybe you didn't even pick up on that. But it is this sense of women as being very sort of powerful and, in fact, very witchy. There's a lot of witch stuff happening here. There's black cats. There's a curse that is put on the river. There's a lot of sort of witch stuff that's happening, which is very important. Which is very important, because there is a lot of attention paid here to superstition, and I kind of loved this because what happens is this superstitious idea, like the people in the town are like, wait, it's so cold, maybe this means something, like it has to mean something that the weather is so terrible. You have this sense of superstition as being kind of on the same level as Catholicism. Like the religious stuff in the book kind of feels on some level like it is the same as superstition, which is really, really beautifully done. It's subtle, again, but it is definitely there. There's a lot of superstitious things happening. Okay, and he goes on then to say, he'd had moments in his marriage when he'd almost feared Eileen and had envied her mettle, her red-hot instincts. So you do have this sense of women as being very powerful and very capable and having this, he says it right here, her mettle, her red hot instincts. So you have this idea of power that this woman has. We're going to look at page 99. So this is when he's talking to Mrs. Kehoe, and he's talking actually about the nuns up at the convent. He stood back and faced her. I mean, she's like a formidable foe here. He has to like stand back and face her because he's really like, she's confronting him and he's really needing to like face up to her power, literally face up to it. Surely they've only as much power as we give them, Mrs. Kehoe. I wouldn't be too sure. She paused then and looked at him the way hugely practical women sometimes looked at men, as though they weren't men at all but foolish boys. More than once, maybe more than several times, Eileen had done the same. So again, you have this idea of Bill as being very cognizant and very clear about the fact that these very powerful women kind of take pity on him. Like he's just like doesn't understand, which is very important because again, the complicity that these women are a party to, the stakes are very high. I mean, it's a very interesting kind of like thought. What is that called? A thought process? No. A thought question. Oh my God, it's going to come to me. A thought experiment. So it's a very interesting thought experiment as you are reading through the book to sort of feel like, oh my God, of course Bill has to do this thing. And then you're like, oh, but wait, like the stakes are high here. So you have this beautiful way that and very subtle way that as the reader, you are coming to appreciate all that is at stake because the women are very, again, hugely practical. I love that phrase. She paused then and looked at him the way hugely practical women sometimes looked at men, as though they weren't men at all but foolish boys. So good. So good. Why is this being told now? Why is she choosing to have it be in December? Why is there this preoccupation with Christmas? Well, I mean, partially because it's a Catholic, novel. So it is very helpful in terms of underscoring a lot of the religious stuff that is happening here. But it's more sort of importantly is this idea of the children and their experience of Christmas. So you have both, it's this idea of this childhood fantasy, and Christmas is so important and so foundational to so many little kids. And we know, we saw one of the very clear flashbacks to Bill's childhood is his memory of Christmas, and it's so sad and disappointing. So you have this sense of the importance of Christmas to children. But we also have this really interesting kind of interplay where his youngest daughter, I think Loretta, maybe is her name, she's scared of Santa Claus. And, lots of kids are scared of Santa Claus. And so you have this sense of this childhood fantasy. God, someone just like slammed a door here. I don't know if you just saw me jump. Whew. I am what's called a highly sensitive person. I'm just constantly like screaming and jumping when things are happening around me. So if you're watching the YouTube and you saw me jump just now, everything's okay. So you have this kind of childhood, fantasy that's happening, but in fact, it's very problematic. So one of the things is that it's really a little creepy. Lots of kids don't like to sit on Santa's lap, and little Loretta is, like really having some fears about adults that are pretty well founded. And this kind of this very young child kind of reaction to the unknown and to sort of Santa in all of his shapes and sizes. And so there's this whole kind of conspiracy about keeping secrets and about keeping, like these kind of traditions and these sorts of things going and not telling children the truth. So, in the case of Santa Claus, for the most part, it's very, it's very like kind, it's fine. Although I really hated it. I just really didn't like this. When people would use Santa Claus as like a bargaining chip, like when my kids were little, they, or other people in their lives would be like, oh, you better be good, or Santa's not going to bring you anything, or, oh, you're going to get coal in your stocking. I mean, that really bothered me. Really, really, really was not my favorite thing. But you have all of this complicity that is happening. And of course, you have to make that next leap to they're being complicit. The adults are being complicit and not telling the children that Santa Claus is not real. And lots of people, and so they're also being complicit about this thing that everybody sort of knows is happening. Interestingly, you get the sense that all the women know that this is happening, and none of the men seem to know that this is happening. And I don't think anybody really understands, when Bill finally makes his discovery, you understand how grave the whole thing actually is. But you have this sense of adults as being complicit in this much kind of, in this kind of yuck thing that's happening in the town. And in fact, you read in the afterword that it was this atrocious, and very, very large scale thing being perpetrated by the church and by the Republic of Ireland. So you have this very, very large scale thing that a lot of adults are complicit in. And it is very resonant with the idea of everybody being complicit about Santa. So you have these kinds of, this whole question of Christmas. It's not just nostalgic. In fact, it doesn't feel very nostalgic. It's kind of ominous in some ways. You have this like this double complicity, and I'm going to argue that in fact, you can take this one step further. There's that sort of argument that people make of like, oh, you believe in the Tooth Fairy and you believe in Santa Claus and you believe in the Easter Bunny and you believe in God. And then people are like, oh no, the Tooth Fairy is not real. And oh wait, no, Santa's not real. And no, the Easter Bunny doesn't exist. But God, yes. God's out there. So I don't mean to offend people who have a lot of faith, but I do think that a lot of the sort of a lot of the questions that young children have about religion and about heaven and about God and Christ, all of that stuff, really, there's some similarities between the sort of the leap of faith, as it were, that you have to believe in Santa, that you also need to have to believe in these like very specific religious tales that we all have learned. Okay. It's not quite this Bill who is going to be this very heroic figure who's going to sort of resurrect all of these people who have been ill-treated by the church. It's not quite that, which I think it's good that it's not that because it's more subtle. But you do have this sense that Christmas, the person Christmas being obviously the birth of Christ, is very tied with this idea of resurrection and this idea of rebirth, because if we believe that Jesus is God's incarnation on earth and he was sent here in order to die and absolve us of our sins and to whatever rise up and like allow us all to follow him to heaven. I mean, wow, I'm not religious, so I don't know if I maybe just butchered that. But, you have this sense of Christmas as being tied very much to this idea of rebirth. So, and heroism and self-sacrifice. So what you have here is Bill, who is very much in this kind of Christ-like position. And again, I'm not going to spoil things for you, but you do have this sense of, if you finish the book, you do have a sense of whether or not he decided to sort of take on that role. And the other thing that I will say, this is kind of, I think it's very significant and it's really beautiful, is that the name of that character, Enda, who we meet later in the novella, Enda, this idea of being like a bird, it also is, it's somebody who brings renewal. So it's a renewer. And beautifully in Foster, the mother, who is in the home with the little girl, is named Enda. So you have this idea of her as being a renewer. She really sort of renews this young child. She has this power and this love and this generosity and warmth to sort of provide something like a rebirth and renewal for this child. And in this case, we have this idea of Enda, who is this this person we meet later in the novel. We have this idea of she and Bill both as being together in this idea of renewal. Again, super subtle. You probably, I don't know, unless you did some real sleuthing and some Googling, or maybe you speak fluent Irish and you knew that. But Enda means not only like a bird, but it also means a redeemer or a renewer. So it's this beautiful resonance that you have in both of the novellas. It's so strong and it is so beautiful. I wanted to read the very, very end of the book about Christmas, but I'm not going to do that because I decided in the beginning that I was not going to, wasn't going to spoil anything for you if you have not already read the book. If you have, I think I've given you plenty of fodder and plenty of direction. I've pointed you in plenty of directions so that if you've already listened or if you've already read the book, then you will be, it's pretty clear, all of my messages that I'm beaming to you across the airwaves. I just found this book so beautiful and so complicated and so rich and really, really rewarding. And so I cannot, if you haven't read it yet, oh my God, you are in for a treat. I would highly recommend rereading it or listening. So if you've read it before, maybe go back and listen to it on Audible. You don't have to listen to the whole thing. It's so beautiful to hear the accents and to really just revel in this incredible prose. And I like to think that after you have listened to this little lecture, that you will have an even richer understanding of Claire Keegan and just how absolutely masterful this novella really is. So, once you're done listening to that, you can head back to the Foxed page and find another lecture to listen to. And thank you so much for spending the time. I really, really love diving in with you all. So happy reading.